On the morning of November 9th, 2007, deputies descended into Fox Cave, a narrow limestone sinkhole hidden beneath the forest floor of McDonald County, Missouri. 20 feet down, roped to the surface, they found the body of 9-year-old Rowan Ford. She had been missing for 6 days. For those 6 days, the town of Stella, Missouri, population under 200, had searched without sleep. What no one knew, her killer was searching alongside them. He volunteered his truck. He comforted the family. He gave investigators tips that pointed them away from himself. Rowan hadn't been taken by a stranger. The man responsible was someone she called Uncle Chris, Christopher Collings, a family friend she trusted completely. Before police finished processing his signed confession, a second man walked into the station and confessed to the same murder. Prosecutors were left with 2 men, 2 confessions, and 1 dead child. And only one of them could be telling the truth. To understand the tragedy that unfolded in McDonald County, Missouri, it is important to know who Rowan Ford was before her name became known through a criminal investigation. She lived in Stella, a quiet rural town where neighbors knew one another and children were expected to grow up surrounded by trust and community. Rowan was remembered as a kind, thoughtful, and unusually caring 9-year-old. She loved attending church and often arrived before anyone else, sitting on the front steps waiting for the pastor so she could help prepare for the service. She wasn't asked to do it, she simply enjoyed helping others. At Tri-Way Elementary School, Rowan was equally loved. Her 4th grade teacher, Todd Holt, described her as the kind of student every teacher hopes to have. Although she struggled with math, she never gave up. Instead, she worked patiently and persistently, earning the admiration of her teachers, one of whom affectionately called her a little ray of sunshine. Behind her cheerful personality, however, Rowan's family faced serious hardships. She sometimes arrived at school without socks on cold mornings or with unwashed hair, quiet signs of financial and emotional struggles at home. Rather than criticize, her teachers compassionately supported her while protecting her dignity. On Friday, November 2nd, 2007, the very last day anyone at Tri-Way Elementary would ever see her alive, a teacher named Tammy Marshall noticed that Rowan's hair was particularly tangled. Before the morning bell rang, Marshall pulled the little girl aside into a quiet corner of the classroom. For 30 minutes, with infinite patience, the teacher gently worked a brush through every single knot, chatting with Rowan until her hair was smooth and bound securely in a neat ponytail. Tammy Marshall later recalled, with tears welling in her eyes, "She looked so happy as she skipped by me, like everything was great with her." That 30-minute session with a hairbrush was the last act of tenderness Rowan Ford would ever receive from the world. Rowan lived in a crowded house with her mother, Colleen, and her 25-year-old stepfather, David Spears. Colleen was the financial anchor of the home, working grueling overnight shifts at the local Walmart to keep food on the table. Every single time Colleen returned home from a long night shift, the routine was exactly the same. The moment the front door clicked open, Rowan would come charging full speed down the hallway, her arms thrown wide, throwing herself into her mother's lap as if they had been separated for years rather than hours. But there was another presence in that household. Christopher Collings was David Spears' longtime friend. They had grown up in the same rural circles, worked the same local farms, and drank at the same bars. Earlier that year, when Collings found himself down on his luck and needing a place to stay, Spears opened his door. Collings moved into the basement. He ate their food, sat at their kitchen table, and on many afternoons, he sat beside Rowan, patiently helping her with her fourth-grade homework. Rowan grew to love him. She felt entirely safe around the towering 6'3", 300-pound man. She called him Uncle Chris. By late October, Collings had finally moved out of the basement, relocating 10 minutes east to a dilapidated trailer parked on his family's farm in the nearby town of Wheaton. But the geographical distance didn't sever the bond. He was still a constant fixture in their daily lives. On the evening of Friday, November 2nd, 2007, the weekend began with a mundane, predictable routine. David Spears, Christopher Collings, and a mutual friend named Nathan Mahurin met up after work, bought a substantial amount of alcohol, and headed back to Spears' house to shoot pool and drink. At 8:30 p.m., Colleen kissed Rowan goodbye, saw that she was asleep on her bedroom floor, and left for her overnight shift at Walmart. As far as Colleen knew, her daughter was under the safest protection possible. Her husband was in the living room, and lifelong friends were there. As the night wore on, the men consumed more alcohol and began smoking marijuana. At some point, Collings suggested they move the gathering to his trailer in Wheaton. Spears agreed, and the men piled into their vehicles, leaving the house completely dark. A 9-year-old girl was left entirely alone in a rural home in the dead of night. Around midnight, Nathan Mahurin decided he was too intoxicated to continue driving. He knew that State Highway A, the fastest, most direct route between Wheaton and Stella, was frequently patrolled by local sheriff's deputies looking for drunk drivers. To avoid arrest, Mahurin decided to take the back roads, a winding, unpaved labyrinth of rural lanes that took significantly longer to traverse. He loaded David Spears into his vehicle to drop him back home. It was at this precise moment that Christopher Collings did something that stripped away any argument of sudden impulse or alcohol-induced blackout. He did the math. Collings knew that Mahurin was taking the slow, tortuous back roads to drop David off. He knew that if he jumped into his own truck immediately and took State Highway A, pressing the gas pedal down and flying along the empty blacktop, he could reach the Spears household before Mahurin's car ever arrived. He knew there was a window of time where the house would be completely unprotected, and he knew exactly who was inside. This was not a crime of passion. It was a cold, mathematical calculation. Collings sped through the Missouri night, arriving at the darkened Stella home well ahead of his friends. He let himself in. He knew the layout of the house perfectly. He had lived there for months. He walked down the carpeted hallway, past the family photos, and stepped into the pink bedroom. Rowan was sound asleep on the floor. Collings scooped the sleeping 9-year-old up into his massive arms. He did it so smoothly, so quietly, that she never even woke up. He carried her out to his truck, laid her down, and drove back to Wheaton. When they arrived at his trailer, he carried her inside into the pitch blackness. He deliberately kept the lights off. He did not speak a single word, even as Rowan began to rouse from her sleep. He knew that if he spoke, Rowan would instantly recognize the deep, familiar voice of Uncle Chris. When she woke up in the dark, she realized a massive figure was hovering over her, and she fought. But a 9-year-old child stands no chance against a man of Collings' size. He brutally assaulted her in the dark. Afterward, as Collings would later claim to police, he intended to take her back home. He led her outside into the yard, holding her firmly from behind, keeping her body facing away from him, so she could never catch a glimpse of his face. He had controlled every variable. He had managed the timing, the route, the silence, the darkness. But Christopher Collings forgot to account for the sky. It was a perfectly clear November night, and the autumn moon was full, casting a stark, silver light across the open fields of Wheaton. As they walked toward the truck, Rowan turned her head sharply, looking back over her shoulder. The moonlight caught Collings' face. In that split second, the terror of a faceless monster vanished, replaced by a far deeper, more horrifying realization. The man who had just violated her was Uncle Chris. She looked into his eyes, and she recognized him. Collings later told investigators that he completely freaked out. He knew his life was over the moment she told her mother. Sitting in the yard was an old, out-of-service pickup truck, and resting in the rusty bed was a tangled coil of nylon rope. Collings reached for it. Rowan Ford was strangled to death in the moonlight, in a lonely field in Wheaton, Missouri, by a man she had spent the last year trusting with her homework. Collings loaded her small body into the back of his truck and drove south, crossing into McDonald County, navigating by memory to the remote mouth of Fox Cave. He dropped her 20 feet down into the sinkhole. He grabbed branches from the surrounding woods and tried to drag them over the opening to conceal the drop. But the hole was too wide. The branches snapped and fell down into the darkness, landing on top of her. He drove back to his trailer. He found blood on his mattress and his clothing. With methodical calm, he gathered Rowan's missing clothing, the rope, and his own blood-soaked garments, and stuffed them into his wood-burning stove, watching them turn to ash. Then, he rolled up the ruined mattress, dragged it into a barn, stuffed it into a 55-gallon steel drum alongside an old roll of carpet, and set it on fire inside the structure, so the smoke wouldn't be visible from the road. With the evidence destroyed, Christopher Collings went to sleep. The next morning, he woke up, climbed into his truck, and drove right back to the Spears home to help look for his missing niece. At 9 a.m. on Saturday, November 3rd, Colleen walked through her front door, exhausted from her shift at Walmart, her arms ready for the inevitable impact of her daughter running down the hall. Instead, she met total silence. The house was empty. Colleen checked the pink bedroom, the bathroom, and the kitchen. Nothing. She walked into the living room and found David Spears dead asleep on the couch, reeking of stale alcohol. She shook him awake, demanding to know where Rowan was. Spears, barely able to open his eyes, mumbled that she had probably gone to a friend's house. Colleen's stomach dropped. She spent the next several hours on the phone, calling every family in Stella, every classmate, every neighbor Rowan had ever mentioned. The answer was a monotonous, terrifying chorus. "No, we haven't seen her. No, she isn't here." Colleen told Spears they needed to call the police immediately. Spears refused. He told her she was overreacting, that Rowan was a good kid and would wander back home when she was hungry, and that calling the cops would bring unnecessary trouble to the house. He forced her to wait. Colleen sat on the porch steps, watching the sun climb to its apex and then begin its long descent into the western horizon. By 6:50 p.m., nearly 10 hours after she first discovered her daughter was missing, Colleen could no longer be contained. She dialed 911. Newton County Sheriff Chris Jennings recognized the gravity of the call immediately. In a town like Stella, a 9-year-old doesn't just lose track of time for 10 hours. Within 60 minutes, an Amber Alert was flashing across television screens and highway signs across the state of Missouri. What followed was an unprecedented mobilization of a rural community. Nearly every single able-bodied adult in Stella abandoned their Saturday evening plans, grabbed flashlights, and walked out into the freezing night. They formed human chains, their breath pluming in the cold air, calling out Rowan's name. Among those searchers, leading the charge with a look of deep, agonizing concern on his face, was Christopher Collings. Over the next 5 days, as 50 specialized FBI agents, federal tracking dogs, and the Missouri State Highway Patrol descended on the area, Collings put on a masterclass in psychological manipulation. He didn't hide from law enforcement. He ran toward them. He walked into the sheriff's office entirely voluntarily, offering statements and expressing his profound worry for the little girl. He willingly underwent a polygraph examination and a computer voice stress analysis, passing both with the practiced calm of a sociopath. He went out of his way to check on Colleen, sitting with her on the porch, offering words of comfort. And then, he took his performance a step further. He began systematically feeding information to the FBI, suggesting that they look closely at David Spears. He told agents he had noticed strange behavior from David, volunteered to wear a hidden recording wire to get his friend to confess, and pointedly suggested specific rural locations where search teams should focus their efforts, locations that were miles away from the sinkhole in McDonald County. The strategy was working perfectly. Investigators, deeply troubled by David Spears' 10-hour delay in reporting his stepdaughter missing, quickly locked onto him as their primary suspect. They caught Spears in multiple contradictions regarding his timeline that night, including a stunning admission that he had left his house a second time at 1 a.m., borrowing his mother's car and driving aimlessly for 5.5 hours with no verifiable alibi. To the FBI, the case was clear. David Spears had killed his stepdaughter, and Christopher Collings was just a helpful, grieving family friend. But Collings had not accounted for Wheaton Personal Police Chief Clinton Clark. Clinton Clark was not a detached federal agent working out of a field office. He was a local lawman who had known Christopher Collings for 17 years, ever since Collings was a troubled young boy navigating a fractured foster care system. Clark had been close with Collings' adoptive parents and had been the primary source of emotional support Collings called when his mother passed away. There was genuine, deep-seated history and trust between the two men. On Monday, November 5th, while Collings was driving through Wheaton, he flagged down Chief Clark's patrol car. He started talking about the search, repeating his script about how worried he was and how much he wanted Rowan found. But Clark noticed something that an investigator unfamiliar with Collings would have missed. As Collings spoke, he refused to make eye contact. He kept his eyes locked on the gravel dashboard of the patrol car, his foot tapping nervously, his posture rigid and defensive. In 17 years of knowing the man, Clark had never seen Collings look away from him. He could see a massive, invisible weight pressing down behind the big man's eyes. Chief Dan Clark believed Christopher Collings would never confess to federal agents in a formal interrogation. Having known him for years, Clark told the FBI that if anyone could get through to him, it would be someone he trusted. The investigators agreed, allowing Clark to maintain friendly contact while the pressure slowly mounted. By November 7th, Collings was beginning to crack. During another interview, investigators questioned him about Rowan directly. He became defensive and emotional, slammed his hands on the table, declared the interview over, and walked out. Later that evening, Collings sought out Clark, saying he intended to stop cooperating with the FBI and hire a lawyer. Clark calmly read him his Miranda rights and asked him to sign a waiver, which he did. Sitting alone in Clark's patrol car, Collings broke down in tears, insisting he loved Rowan and would never hurt her. Before Clark could continue the conversation, another officer interrupted, and the moment was lost. Clark immediately warned the FBI that Collings was close to confessing, but that time was running out. The next breakthrough came unexpectedly. Newton County Coroner Mark Bridges asked Rowan's stepfather, David Spears, to imagine where Collings might have taken her. After a long silence, Spears led Bridges to a wooded area in McDonald County. There, Bridges discovered the hidden opening of Fox Cave and noticed signs that something was wrong. The following morning, search teams descended into the sinkhole and recovered Rowan Ford's body. As news of the discovery spread, Collings arrived at the Wheaton Police Department asking to see Clark, then abruptly drove away. Clark located him a short time later and persuaded him to meet privately. Inside the patrol car, Clark quietly said, "It's over. We found Rowan this morning." Collings appeared defeated and asked to be taken somewhere secluded. At Munn Bridge, he stepped from the vehicle, held out his wrists, and silently waited to be handcuffed. When Clark replied that it wasn't necessary yet, Collings answered with quiet certainty, "It will be." They walked down the dirt slope beneath the bridge, sitting side by side on the concrete embankment. And there, with the sound of the running creek water beneath them, Christopher Collings confessed. He walked Clark through the entire night with chilling precision. The calculation of the timelines, the drive down Highway A, the silent abduction of the sleeping girl, the assault in the darkened trailer. He described the moment of recognition in the yard, the moonlight catching his face, the realization that she knew he was Uncle Chris. Chief Clark sat in absolute silence as Collings raised his large hands into the air beneath the bridge, mimicking the motion of holding a thick rope, and whispered the words that would haunt the police chief for the rest of his life. "I pulled it tight." If Christopher Collings' confession had been the conclusion of the investigation, the road to justice would have been straight and narrow. He repeated the entire confession hours later at the station, in front of an array of county deputies and federal agents, followed by a detailed, videotaped statement at the Barry County Sheriff's Department. There was not a single contradiction in his timeline. It matched every piece of physical geography perfectly. But then, investigators brought David Spears back into the interrogation room. They informed the stepfather that Rowan had been found and that Collings had fully confessed to her murder. What happened next threw the entire legal architecture of the state of Missouri into absolute chaos. David Spears broke down completely. But instead of expressing shock or relief that the killer had been caught, Spears gave a detailed, exhaustive confession of his own that stopped every law enforcement officer in the room dead in their tracks. Spears claimed that when he returned home from the bar that night, he discovered Rowan's bed was empty. He stated that he instantly knew his friend Christopher had taken her. He claimed he borrowed his mother's car, drove directly to Collings' trailer in Wheaton, and walked inside. But instead of rescuing his stepdaughter, Spears confessed that he joined in the assault. He went even further, claiming that Collings eventually handed him the nylon rope and told him to finish it. According to the official interrogation transcripts, David Spears looked directly at the detectives and said, "I choke her with it. I realize she's gone. she's really gone. The prosecutors were suddenly handed a logistical impossibility. They had two separate men, both locked in independent interrogation rooms, both fully confessing to being the sole hand that pulled the rope that ended Rowan Ford's life. The physical evidence against Collings' trailer was overwhelming. The burn barrel, the ashes in the wood stove, the blood on the property. But the physical evidence surrounding David Spears was terrifyingly ambiguous. Investigators brought in 3 separate independent cadaver dogs to search the vehicle Spears had borrowed during his missing 5.5-hour window that night. All 3 dogs, working independently without their handlers knowing the details of the case, alerted violently on the vehicle. They hit on the driver's side door, the left rear quadrant, the driver's seat, and the rear cargo area. The dogs were telling investigators one undeniable fact. A decomposing human body, or clothing heavily saturated with the fluids of a deceased human, had been inside that car. Furthermore, a forensic analysis of Spears' computer hard drives revealed years of highly disturbing, predatory content targeting children. Yet, there was no physical trace of David Spears at the actual crime scene inside Collings' trailer. And Christopher Collings, who had already admitted to everything and had absolutely nothing left to lose or protect, firmly, repeatedly, and aggressively denied that Spears had anything to do with the crime. Every time the FBI presented Spears' confession to Collings, Collings grew angry, stating that David was a coward and a drunk who was asleep on a couch miles away when the murder occurred. This created a legal trap for prosecutor Johnny Cox. If the state attempted to bring first-degree murder charges against both men, they would have to argue in front of a jury that 2 contradictory stories were simultaneously true. A skilled defense attorney for Collings could easily use Spears' signed confession to create reasonable doubt, arguing to a jury that Spears was the real killer, potentially walking Collings off a death sentence or getting his conviction overturned entirely on appeal. The prosecution was forced to make a deal with the devil to secure the conviction of the primary monster. The murder charges against David Spears were dropped. In exchange, Spears pleaded guilty to lesser charges of child endangerment and hindering prosecution for his role in delaying the report of Rowan's disappearance and lying to investigators. He was sentenced to 11 years in prison. With credit for time served since his initial arrest in 2007, David Spears completed his sentence and walked out of a Missouri State Penitentiary in 2015, a completely free man. For Colleen and the remaining members of Rowan's family, it was a devastating, structural failure of the justice system. The man who was supposed to protect her, the man who had ordered her mother to wait 10 hours while her daughter lay dead in a sinkhole, had successfully navigated the legal loopholes to a decade-long sentence, while the full truth of his involvement remained locked forever in the dark. In March 2012, 5 years after Rowan was pulled from Fox Cave, Christopher Collings finally stood trial in Phelps County, Missouri, after a change of venue was ordered due to the intense media saturation in the southwestern corner of the state. The defense team faced an impossible mountain of evidence. They chose to focus entirely on mitigation, attempting to spare him from the death penalty. They brought forward psychologists who detailed Collings' horrific childhood, describing an infant shuttled between abusive biological parents and neglectful foster homes, resulting in a severe diagnosed reactive attachment disorder. They argued that the killing was entirely unplanned, a sudden, blind panic triggered by the unexpected moonlight catching his face in the yard. The prosecution countered not with rhetoric, but with the painful voices of those left behind. Rowan's mother, Colleen, who had filed for divorce from David Spears the exact same month she buried her daughter, took the witness stand. Her voice was cracked, a shadow of the woman who used to greet her daughter at the door. Colleen to the courtroom, "There's not much of a life. I cry a lot. I've been admitted to psychiatric care multiple times since she was found. I just couldn't take it anymore. I'm trying to get my life back to a simple something of a life." Todd Holt, the fourth-grade teacher, stood before the jury and repeated the promise he had made to himself in 2007. "I will never be able to walk into that classroom ever again for the rest of my career and not be able to tell you exactly where Rowan was sitting the day she went missing, and exactly where her desk was the day we found out she was gone." The jury listened to the details of the horror that Rowan's last hours had been. When they were sent to deliberate, they did not look at the defense's binders on childhood trauma. They returned to the courtroom in just 48 minutes. The verdict was guilty of murder in the first degree. During the penalty phase, the jury added a specific structural finding: that Rowan Ford's death involved torture, that it was outrageously and wantonly vile, horrible, and inhumane, and that she was murdered for the explicit purpose of silencing a witness. The sentence was death. For the next 12 years, the machinery of corporate appeals ground on slowly. The case traveled through the Missouri Supreme Court, the U.S. District Court, the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals, and all the way to the steps of the United States Supreme Court. Every single door was systematically shut. Clemency petitions detailing brain abnormalities were presented to Governor Mike Parson, who denied them flatly, stating, "Mr. Collins has received every protection afforded by the Constitution. His sentence remains for his horrendous and callous crime." On December 3, 2024, the final chapter was written at the state penitentiary in Bonne Terre, Missouri. Rowan Ford would have been 26 years old that day. At 6 p.m., the witnesses were led into their designated observation rooms behind the thick glass of the execution chamber. In one room sat 4 members of Collins' legal team and several journalists. In the adjacent room sat Colleen and one of Rowan's surviving brothers. Sitting alongside them was the now retired Newton County Sheriff, Chris Jennings. Jennings had personally requested a state seat at the execution. He felt it was his duty to stay with Rowan until the very end. Tucked into the breast pocket of his suit jacket, right over his heart, where it had been every single day since November 2007, was Rowan Ford's plastic Tri-Way Elementary School identification card. Collins, now 49 years old, was strapped to a gurney, an IV line running into his arm. A single lethal dose of pentobarbital was administered. He turned his head slightly toward a spiritual advisor at his side, spoke a few final quiet words, and then breathed heavily, swallowing hard twice. Within seconds, all movement ceased. He was pronounced dead at 6:11 p.m. His final written statement, released by the Department of Corrections, reflected the same strange, detached calm he had maintained for 17 years. "Right or wrong, I accept this situation for what it is. To anyone that I have hurt in this life, I am sorry. I hope that you are able to get closure and move on. You are in my prayers, and I hope to see you in heaven one day." When informed of his final words, Rowan's older sister, Ariane, rejected the sentiment with fierce, unyielding anger. She told reporters, "I wanted him dead. I still do. They could have done something far worse than lethal injection because he went out easy. I cannot even imagine the panic my little sister felt. He was so big and she was so small. She never had a fighting chance." The execution of Christopher Collings provided a legal end to the case, but it did not provide an answer to the ghost that still hovers over southwest Missouri. Shortly after his release from prison in 2015, David Spears, the man who had signed a confession admitting to pulling the rope, the man whose computer held dark secrets, the man whose borrowed car set off 3 separate cadaver dogs, went right back to work. He was hired as an administrative clerk by the Missouri State Public Defender's Office, the exact same institutional office that had handled his and Collings' defense cases. He was hired by the husband of his original trial attorney. Years after the case, David Spears declined to discuss Christopher Collings, or Rowan's murder, ending a reporter's call with a brief statement before hanging up. While Collings' life ended by execution, Spears remained a free man. Stella, however, chose to honor Rowan rather than dwell on the legal controversy. In April 2025, on what would have been her 27th birthday, Triway Elementary School unveiled a polished marble memorial bench in her memory. Former teachers, including Todd Holt and Tammy Marshall, attended the dedication, remembering Rowan as a child who felt safe and deeply loved at school. The memorial stands as a lasting promise that Rowan Ford will never be forgotten.